She was standing at the door of my bunkhouse with rain already soaking through her dress and lightning cracking open the sky behind her. And the first words out of her mouth were the ones that changed everything. "Can I stay here tonight?" she asked, and her voice was steady even though she was shaking. And I looked past her at the dark field and the way the storm was coming in hard from the north. And I truly thought, that the hardest thing I would have to do that night was say no. I was wrong. I stepped back from the door and I told her to come in. And when she crossed the threshold and looked around the single small room and saw the single narrow bed pushed against the far wall, something moved across her face that was not quite a smile and not quite a question. It was something in between, something I had no name for yet. Something I would spend months trying to forget. My name is Caleb Walker, and by the time I stopped at the Merritt homestead, I had been drifting for 3 years. I had ridden in from the north along the old cattle trail, my horse Cinder pulling up lame about 4 miles east of a town called Harlow's Crossing, and the nearest ranch within walking distance belonged to a man named Earl Merritt. He was a big man, Earl, loud in that particular way that men on isolated land sometimes get, like they've been talking to themselves so long they've forgotten how to measure their own volume. He had broad hands and a rough laugh, and he hired me on the spot because it was late October and he needed someone to work the winter before the ground froze solid. He offered me the bunkhouse, 2 meals a day, and $2 a week. I took it without asking much. I didn't ask much about anything back then. It was easier that way. Earl Merritt left for town on a Tuesday. He went to Harlow's Crossing to settle a debt with the feed merchant and conduct whatever business he conducted in the back room of the Silver Spur Saloon, which from what I understood was the kind of business that kept a man away from home for 2 or 3 days at a time. He told me to watch over the homestead, fix the fence line on the south pasture, and keep the horses watered. He said it the way a man says it when he is already thinking about where he is going, not what he is leaving behind. He drove the wagon out just after dawn, and I watched it until it disappeared into the gray distance of the Kansas prairie. If you're enjoying this story so far, go ahead and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling us what city you're watching from. We'll leave you a heart right there in the comments. Now, let's keep going, because the night is just getting started. For 2 days after Earl left, I barely saw Clara. She kept to the main house, and I kept to the fields and the barn, and we exchanged nothing more than a nod at the supper she left on the back porch. I had learned early on the frontier that the wives of employers were a category to be respected from a distance. I had ridden through enough broken homesteads to know how easily that line could blur when loneliness did its quiet, patient work on 2 people. But on the 3rd night, the storm came. It started in the afternoon as a low pressure moving in from the northwest, the kind that turns the sky a bruised greenish gray and makes the horses restless in their stalls. I spent the late hours of the daylight securing what I could. The barn doors, the water troughs, a length of fence on the east side that had been leaning for days. By the time full dark fell, the wind had picked up to something with teeth in it, driving cold rain sideways across the open land and making the oil lamp in the bunkhouse flutter and sway even with the door shut. I had settled in with my boots off and my hat hung on the post, reading the one tattered book I carried in my saddlebag, a worn copy of a Dickens novel someone had left at a way station in Nebraska, when I heard the knock. It was not a timid knock. It was 3 sharp raps, close together, the kind you make when you mean to be heard over weather. I set the book down and pulled on my boots and crossed to the door, and when I opened it, there she was. Clara Merritt, standing in the rain with a shawl pulled tight over her shoulders and water running in rivers down the loose strands of auburn hair that had come free from her pins, and in her arms she was carrying a folded blanket and a small lamp that the wind had already snuffed out. "Can I stay here tonight?" she said. I reckon I stood there for a moment longer than was polite. "What happened?" I asked. "The east wall of the main room," she said, and her voice was controlled, but I could hear the edges of it fraying. "The wind took part of the roof with it. There's rain coming in through the ceiling. I can't stay in there tonight." I stepped back and let her in. What else was I going to do? One, she was the wife of the man who employed me. She was standing in a storm, and the only alternative shelter on the property was the barn, which I would have offered before asking her to sleep with the horses. She came inside and looked around the room, the way a person's eyes adjust to a new space. The small table, the oil lamp burning low on the shelf, my hat on the post, my saddlebag leaned against the wall, and then the bed. One bed, narrow enough that a man could touch both walls if he stretched his arms. Blanket folded back, pillow dented from where my head had been. Clara looked at it for a moment, and then she looked at me, and then something crossed her face. A flicker, like light moving across water, and she smiled. It was not a calculated smile. That was the thing about it. It was not the smile of a woman playing a game, or issuing an invitation, or testing the ground. It was the smile of a woman who had just realized that a situation had become either very funny or very honest, and she had decided to take it as the latter. "I reckon this complicates things," she said quietly. "I'll take the floor," I said. "Caleb?" She said my name the way she had said it exactly once before, when I had fixed the pump on the water trough and she had come out to check the work. Easy and direct, like she had always known how to say it. "The floor is half mud. There's a gap under the door, and it's been blowing in since yesterday." She was right. There was a rime of wet mud along the threshold. I had been meaning to fix it, and I hadn't. I looked at the floor, and then I looked at the bed, and then I looked at her, and I thought about Earl Merritt sitting in the back of the Silver Spur Saloon in Harlow's Crossing 2 days' ride away, and I said, "I'll sleep in the barn." "You'll take sick sleeping in that cold," she said. "The barn's not warm enough tonight, and you know it." There was a silence between us that had more weight in it than most conversations I'd had that entire year. The rain hammered at the roof, and the wind pushed at the walls, and the lamp threw its small, warm circle of light across the two of us standing 4 feet apart in that tiny room. And I thought, this is how stories start. This is the exact moment men look back on later and say, "Right there." That was the place. If I had gone to the barn, everything would have been different. I did not go to the barn. "There's enough blanket on that bed for 2 people to sleep decent without any nonsense," I said, and I meant every word of it, and I held her gaze when I said it so she would know I meant it. "You take your side. I take mine. Come morning, the storm will have passed, and we'll go fix the roof of the main house." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she set her damp shawl over the chair by the table, smoothed her hair back from her face with both hands, and sat down on the edge of the bed. "Much obliged," she said simply. I blew out the lamp. The darkness settled around us like something familiar, not uncomfortable, just present. And I lay on my side of the bed with one arm folded beneath my head and listened to the storm work itself out against the walls of the bunkhouse. Clara lay still beside me, close enough that I could hear her breathing, but not touching me. And for a long while, neither of us said anything, and I thought maybe that was how the night would pass. 2 people lying in the dark, being decent, waiting for morning. It was Clara who broke the silence. "How long have you been drifting?" she asked. Her voice was quiet, aimed at the ceiling, like the question was more for herself than for me. 3 years, I said, give or take. Where were you before that?" I took a breath. "I had a place," I said, "up in Wyoming Territory. Small ranch. Good land." I stopped there because the next part was the part I didn't generally tell people. She waited. She was good at waiting. I was coming to understand. It was not the waiting of a woman with nothing to say. It was the waiting of a woman who understood that some things needed room to come out on their own. "Lost it," I said finally. "Drought 2 seasons running, then a fire. Nothing left worth staying for." I paused. No one left worth staying for, either. The storm shifted overhead, rain coming harder for a moment and then easing. She was quiet for a breath or two before she said, "I'm sorry." "It was a while ago," I said. "That doesn't always make it smaller." I turned my head and looked at the darkness where her voice was coming from. "No," I said. "I reckon it doesn't." Another silence, different from the first. This one had something in it that felt like permission, and I wasn't sure what to do with that. "What keeps you moving?" she asked. "Most men settle eventually." "Most men have something to settle toward," I said. She took that in without answering for a moment, and then she said very quietly, "I envy that sometimes. The moving." A pause. "Don't tell anyone I said that." "Who would I tell?" She made a small sound that was almost a laugh, soft, careful, quickly swallowed. "Fair enough," she said. I stared at the ceiling and thought about what she had just said and what it meant about her life in this isolated homestead with a man like Earl Merritt, and I told myself very clearly and very deliberately not to think about it too long. Some things you understand in a moment, and then you have to let them pass, because the understanding is enough. Acting on it is another country entirely. "How long have you and Earl been married?" I asked, because it felt like the question I should ask, the one that reminded both of us where we were. 7 years, she said. "Since I was 21. Another pause. "My father thought he was a good match. He had land and ambition." Her voice carried no bitterness and no particular warmth either. It was simply the voice of a woman reciting a fact she had made peace with. "He was right, I suppose. Earl works hard." "He does," I said, because it was true. She didn't say anything else for a while after that. The storm continued to press itself against the bunkhouse, and the lamp was out, and the night was full of the particular intimacy that darkness and weather create between two people, whether they ask for it or not. I lay there, and I thought about Wyoming, and about the land I had lost, and about the way some men carry their losses like stones in their pockets until the weight decides their direction for them. I had been doing that for 3 years. I had gotten so used to the weight I had almost stopped noticing it was there. I fell asleep before I realized I was going to. I do not know what hour it was when I woke. The storm had quieted to a low wind and intermittent rain, and the darkness had thinned just barely at the edges, the way it does in the last hours before dawn when the sky begins its long, slow decision to become morning again. Something had woken me, though I couldn't say what. I lay still and listened. Clara was not asleep. I could tell by the quality of her breathing. Too controlled, too deliberate. The breathing of a person trying not to be heard thinking. She was lying beside me in the dark, and she was wide awake, and something in the careful stillness of her told me she had been awake for a while. "Were you all right?" I asked. A beat. "Yes." Then, after a moment, "No, not entirely." I waited, the way she had taught me without knowing it. "I keep thinking," she said slowly, "about what happens when Earl comes back." She stopped, started again. "Not because of this. We haven't done anything wrong. I know that." Her voice was precise and careful. But because I realize that when he comes back, I'll feel something close to dread, and I've been trying not to know that for a long time. The words landed in the dark between us like stones dropped into still water, and the ripples went out a long way. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that wouldn't cross a line. "I'm sorry," she said. "I shouldn't have said that to you." "You needed to say it to someone," I said. "That's the trouble with isolation," she said quietly. "Well, you run out of someone's." She shifted slightly beside me, and I felt the warmth of her presence like something I had been trying not to be aware of for the last several hours. "You're easy to talk to, Caleb. Dangerous kind of easy." "I reckon that's the kindest warning I've ever received," I said. A real laugh this time, soft and low, quickly gone. "Take it as one," she said. The darkness sat between us like something live, and I was aware of every inch of space that remained, and every inch that had quietly, without either of us quite deciding it, disappeared. She was close. So the kind of close that becomes a fact of the world when you have been lying in the dark for hours with rain on the roof, and honesty in the air, and nothing between you and another person's warmth but a few inches of mattress and the better nature you are trying to hold on to. "Clara," I said. "I know," she said softly. And that was enough. Those two words contained everything that neither of us was going to say, and everything neither of us was going to do. And also, this was the part that made it hard, everything that both of us understood was true, whether or not we named it. I stared at the ceiling, and she lay still beside me, and the storm finished its business with the Kansas prairie and moved on. And eventually, the darkness outside began in earnest to become gray. Before you keep reading, if this story is getting to you, you go ahead and subscribe to the channel and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. We'll give you a heart right there. Now let's see how this ends. Dawn came in slow and flat across the open land, the way it does after a hard storm when the sky has been wrung out and the world looks scrubbed. I got up first. That felt like the right thing. I pulled on my boots and my vest in the early quiet, and I went to the small stove in the corner and got a fire going, and I filled the tin pot with water from the jug by the wall and set it to heat. I did all of this without looking at the bed, which was a kind of discipline I had not known I possessed. When the water was hot, I made 2 cups of coffee. Real coffee from the small pouch I kept in my saddlebag, on the one indulgence I hadn't given up in 3 years of drifting. And I set one on the table, and then I sat down in the chair and looked out the small window at the wet gray morning. Behind me, I heard Clara sit up, the creak of the bed frame, the soft sounds of a woman composing herself. Then she was there at the table, sitting across from me, her hair loose around her shoulders, the way it must look every morning before she pinned it, and she wrapped both hands around the tin cup and looked at me across it, and neither of us said anything for a long moment. "The roof," I said finally. "Yes," she said. "I'll go look at the damage, see what I can patch before Earl gets back." "That would be good," she said. Her voice was even, and her eyes were steady. And there was nothing in her face that spoke of regret or calculation or anything complicated at all. Just a woman sitting across from a man in the early morning drinking coffee, which was both the simplest and most complicated thing in the world. "Caleb," she said when I was about to stand. I waited. She looked at her coffee and then at me. "Thank you," she said, "for last night, for being decent." The word landed somewhere in my chest and settled there. Decent. 3 years of drifting, and that was what I had managed to be. I didn't say it the way I thought it. I wasn't that kind of a man. I said, "You'd have done the same." She looked at me with those honey-brown eyes, steady and warm. "I think you're probably worth more than you know," she said quietly. Then she stood, took her cup, and walked out into the wet morning light. I sat in that chair for a while after she left. The stove ticked. The wind moved across the prairie grass with a sound like a long exhale. Somewhere in the barn, Cinder shuffled in her stall. I thought about Wyoming again, and about the land that was gone, and about the fire that had taken everything. And I thought about the fact that for the first time in a long time, I had woken up in the morning and felt something other than the particular emptiness of a man with nowhere to be and nothing to build toward. It wasn't hers to give, and I knew it. She belonged to this homestead and to a man who drove away in wagons and came back smelling of saloon smoke, and that was the plain fact of it. And no night in a small room with an honest conversation and a dangerous warmth could change the arithmetic of the thing. But something had shifted, and something quiet and permanent, the way the land shifts after a storm. Not visible exactly, but real. The kind of shift you only understand later, looking back. Earl Merritt came back that afternoon. He drove the wagon up the dirt track in the pale midday light, mud-spattered and loud, and he was in reasonable spirits for a man who had spent 3 days in town, which meant he had come out ahead in whatever transactions he had conducted at the Silver Spur. He swung down from the wagon and looked at the east wall of the main house with his hands on his hips and said, "Well, I'll be damned." And then he looked at me and said, "You fix any of that?" "Some of it," I said. "Got the worst of the gap closed. Needs a proper repair." "Good man," he said, and clapped me on the shoulder with one of those big hands and went inside. And that was that. I watched him go. I thought about Clara inside, setting supper together, hearing his boots on the porch. I thought about the look on her face when she had said, "I keep thinking about what happens when Earl comes back," and I told myself the same thing I had been telling myself all day. You are a drifter, Caleb Walker. You pass through. That is what you do. I worked the remainder of the afternoon, and I ate supper at the main house the way I did every night, and Earl was talkative about the goings-on in Harlow's Crossing, and Clara was quiet in the way she was always quiet. And I kept my eyes on my plate and said the appropriate things at the appropriate times, and when supper was done, I excused myself and walked back across the dark yard to the bunkhouse. I lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling and listened to the wind, which was gentler now, the storm well past. I did not sleep for a long while. 3 weeks later, I rode out. I didn't plan it more than a day ahead of time. I had finished most of the major work Earl had needed done, and the weather had turned properly cold, and my horse was healed and ready. And the truth of it was that there was a kind of weight building on that homestead that was the wrong kind of weight for me to be carrying. Not because anything more had happened. Nothing had. Clara and I were perfectly proper with one another. Good morning and thank you, and the weather's looking clearer, and all of it completely decent. But decency has its own strain when it is running against the current of something real, and I knew myself well enough by then to know that the longer I stayed, the harder the decent thing would become. I told Earl I was moving on south before the full winter set in. He shook my hand and paid me what he owed me, and told me I was a good worker and that he'd have a job for me again come spring if I wanted it. I said much obliged, and I meant it plainly, and I went to saddle Cinder. Clara was at the pump when I led my horse out of the barn. She looked up, and I tipped my hat, and she set down the bucket and came across the yard and stopped about 6 feet away. And she looked at me the way she had looked at me that first night when she had smiled at the one narrow bed. Not calculating, not sorrowful, just honest. "You're going," she said. "Yes, ma'am." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Take care of yourself. I Caleb Walker." "Yes, ma'am," I said again, and I meant that too. She nodded once, and then she turned and walked back toward the main house, and I watched her go. And there it was, the walk of a frontier woman heading back toward the life she was living, shoulders straight, unhurried, carrying what she carried without showing the weight of it. She did not look back. I rode south. I have thought about that night more times than I can count, over the years since. Not with regret, not with the ache of something lost. You cannot lose what was never properly yours, but with something more like awe, the way you feel about country you passed through once and never returned to, but never entirely left behind. The prairie has a way of doing that. You cross some land just once, and it gets into you somewhere deep, and somewhere no amount of moving can quite outrun. I never went back to the Merritt homestead. I thought about it once, the following spring when I was riding north, and the Kansas sky was wide and new-washed after rain. I thought about turning east toward Harlow's Crossing, about what I might find or not find, about whether Earl still drove away on Tuesdays, and whether Clara still stood at the pump with that steadiness in her honey-brown eyes. I rode north instead. Some stories don't end the way the heart wants. Some end the way honor demands, quieter, but cleaner in the chest. I have made my peace with that. The West taught me many things, and maybe the most important was this. The choices you make in a single night, in a small bunkhouse with the storm outside, and one narrow bed, and a woman who smiles at the impossible situation. Those choices are who you are, not the ones you make when it's easy, the ones you make when it isn't. I rode a long way after I left the Merritt place. I drifted through Missouri and Arkansas and crossed the Red River into Texas, working cattle and breaking horses and sleeping under more open skies than I can count. And in all that time, I never quite forgot the sound of rain on a bunkhouse roof and a woman's voice saying, "I think you're probably worth more than you know." I kept that with me. It did not weigh much, but it was mine. And that, I reckon, was enough.